Hi, everybody. I'm Marc Hartzman. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really thrilled to be part of this event. And I thought for this talk called Imagining Mars, A History of Curiosity and Beliefs That Paved Our Journey to the Red Planet, I would start with a glimpse of Mars today. As far as we know, it's the only planet populated entirely by robots, two functioning, several more not. And within the next decade or two, surely humans will join them. This has all become possible, of course, thanks to science. But science has been focused on Mars because of our constant curiosity in it, a constant sense of wonder and desire to learn about and understand our planetary neighbor. And throughout history, all of that has taken on different forms. Some of them seem quite strange today, but to me, they're all part of a chain of interest keeping Mars in the forefront of public consciousness. And they're really fascinating and really make Mars a lot of fun to learn about. So I'm going to start with a story that pulled me into this world and led me down the path of learning more about the strange history of the Red Planet and writing my book, The Big Book of Mars. So for me, it all started with a story about life on Mars, but not the typical kind of life you might think about on Mars, whether it's little green men or microorganisms. This was a 7-foot telepathic Martian named Umar Ru, who made international headlines in 1926. And here's the one that pulled me into it. So at the time, I was publishing I just started publishing a site called weirdhistorian.com. And I was looking for information about Nikola Tesla and his searches to contact Mars. I'd heard about this somewhere and just wanted to dig into it a little bit. But instead, I came across this article while going through newspaper archives. And it really stopped me. It's a truly bizarre headline, right? Been to Mars? Yep. They had big ears, as you can see. So this 1926 story was about a man named Dr. Hugh Mansfield Robinson. He was a lawyer in London, and he claimed to be having these telepathic communications with this Martian woman. Like I said, her name was Umar Ru. And he learned all kinds of amazing things about them. He learned that, here you can see that they used tobacco, for one thing. They had flying ships. They ate electrified fruit. They drank tea as well. So in ways, they were kind of like us, but just a little more advanced and clearly a lot taller. The men were supposedly 8 to 9 feet tall. So as I dug into this story, I was so amazed by what I was learning. First of all, here's a great image you can see of Umar Ru. And I learned that he was going to use, Dr. Hugh Mansfield Robinson was going to use the Rugby radio tower in London, which was the world's tallest, most powerful radio tower in the world at that time, to send a telegram to Mars. So he would go beyond telepathy. He actually sent a telegram. And Umar Ru had assured him that their scientists were awaiting that telegram and they would be able to return it. So this became, like I said, international news, and the whole world was awaiting the answer. Would we actually hear from Martians or not? And this other image here on the side, you can see right here that they were waiting for him, for the message, all gathered around listening through their devices. And this probably won't surprise you, but they didn't get anything back. In fact, you can see they weren't too happy. In fact, they did this twice. They did it in 1928 as well. Both years is when Mars was in opposition to Earth, so it was at its closest point in its orbit, about 35 million miles away. So they thought this was a good chance to send their telegram. But here you can see that this headline from the New York Times: Britain says Martians failed to get his radio. We're annoyed to having to sit up all night. So it wasn't the Martians' fault. It was our fault. Our scientists weren't skilled enough to receive their messages. This is what he heard from Umar Ru. In fact, you can see this great quote down here. They laugh at our scientists because they have got rid of atmospherics altogether, and yet we have not. So again, this idea of intelligent life on Mars was a big deal at this point, and we were not able to catch up to them. So it was our fault we couldn't communicate with the Martians. So, of course, this was, quite an amazing story for me to find. And as I learned more and more about it, I started to learn much more about what was on the periphery about these other beliefs going on. Dr. Hugh Mansfield Robinson was certainly not alone. In fact, in 1909, another year when Mars was in opposition, Harvard's William Henry Pickering was looking at different ways to signal Mars. You can see here it's front page news on the New York Times. And he thought if we could create a giant grid of mirrors, we could flash light signals at Mars. And if those mirrors were giant enough and the grid were large enough, the Martian scientists, assuming they had some sort of device to look through to see Earth, could catch those signals. And it might take months or years of sending signals till they get them, and then it might take them some time to find a way to return those signals. And here you can see this is from an issue of Popular Science from a few years later. But you can see this grid down here of the mirrors, and then the idea of how massive of a flash of light that would be. And then here you can even see here's a small building next to one of these mirrors, so you get a sense of the scale of how big he was thinking. Now, this was going to cost about $10 million, which would have been equivalent to about $250 million today. So needless to say, he didn't get the funding, and this plan never happened. But this was thought about, and as you can see, it made a lot of news. Also in 1909 was another professor at Amherst named Professor David Todd. And he had a different kind of idea. He wanted to build a hot air balloon and ascend 50,000 feet into the air. And he thought there we could get above all the interference of the cities. And then we could receive and potentially send signals or messages to Mars, to and from Mars. No hot air balloon had ever gone that high before. So this was going to be a real new venture for him to undertake. And at one point, he did a test run of 5,000 feet with his wife. You see that over here. Here he is with his wife, and they're getting inside the little cart here to make their ascension. So 1909, this plan didn't happen, as you might have guessed, but he was attempting it. He tried it again in 1920 when Mars was once again going to be in opposition. And at that point, he actually had the government pretty well involved with him. And it was looking like it was going to happen. And then they canceled. The government pulled the plug at the last minute. And so that plan, again, went awry. But it went pretty far for that hot air balloon attempt to contact Martians. And he's got this quote I love. Again, this is from 1909. "If life really exists on Mars, they've been trying for years to get into conversation with us, and perhaps wonder what manner of stupid things we are not to respond." So again, this was a real belief that there was intelligent life on Mars at this period. So in 1912, a French botanist named Edmond Perrier spoke with the New York Times Magazine and described what he thought Martians might look like. And you see this wonderful illustration from that article. And like Umar Ru had told Hugh Mansfield Robinson, the Martians were tall. You can see that here. They have thin legs and large feet. That lower gravity, that 1/3 G, would allow them to grow up taller, than we would here on Earth. It's not being pushed down as much. You can see their large chests for the rarefied air and the larger ears to pull in the sound waves. And then you can also see their, advanced technology. They've got these flying ships and these cool electronic, gadgets and gizmos you're seeing here. Even the architecture looks pretty futuristic. So eventually, of course, I did find Nikola Tesla, who truly believed that we could contact Martians. In fact, he spent decades of his life till the end, determined to contact extraterrestrial life. He thought we could send radio waves to different planets. As early as 1897, as you can see from this headline, he said that we would be able to talk with other worlds, and he'd find ways to contact them. You can see he's looking at all different planets to contact. Here's Mars right here. In 1899, he actually thought he received a message from them. He was at his laboratory atop Pikes Peak in Colorado Springs, and he got a signal that he thought came from Mars, and he believed it said 1, 2, 3. So I believe that was the first extraterrestrial signal we'd seen, or that we'd received. And as I mentioned, he spent the next several decades trying to find ways to contact Martians or other beings. Guglielmo Marconi also thought he was receiving a message from Mars in 1920. You can see from this headline, Marconi asks, "Is Mars signaling Earth? Weird sounds on the wireless." So he'd received this 150,000 meter wavelength signal that he thought could not have come from Earth, convinced it came from Mars, and he spent the next 2 years trying to receive another similar type of message, but he never did. It wasn't until he made a visit to the headquarters of General Electric in Schenectady, New York, that he discovered that the signal he'd received was actually from there. They had been running an unannounced experiment, running that wavelength across the planet, and that's what Marconi had detected. So it was not Mars, unfortunately. It was the far less exotic Schenectady, New York. So let's jump back a little bit. That was kind of hitting on that early 20th century period around Hugh Mansfield Robinson. But this had been going on long before. And of course, you could say our earliest civilizations were all looking up at the sky and seeing the glowing red orb and that was Mars, and giving it their different kinds of names, always kind of referring to bloodshed, the god of war. Each culture had a different name for it. Of course, it's the Romans' god of war, Mars, that stuck, but every different culture had a similar type of name. But we'll just fast forward through time to when science was really getting more involved in what life might be like. So this is 1838, and this is an amateur astronomer named Thomas Dick, who basically took a census of the solar system. And you can see this book here he wrote called Celestial Scenery. And what he did was he took the data that he had of Earth and then the planets in the solar system, what we knew about their size and whatever physics we had about each of these planets. And he knew that in Great Britain, there were 280 people per square mile. So he took that data and he extrapolated it based on the size of the other planets. So that's a big extrapolation. So from that, he believed that there were 22 trillion beings living in the universe. Really, I think the solar system at that point. And that did not include the sun, by the way. The sun, he thought, had 681 trillion beings living on it, which is a whole lot of sunbathers. As for Mars specifically, he believed that there were 15 billion on Mars, but minus a third of that based on the surface that he thought was covered with water. So that was roughly about 10 billion Martians on Mars, based on his rough data. A few years later, famed German mathematician and physicist Carl Friedrich Gauss proposed that we could communicate with Martians through the universal language of math. So he thought if we could create this massive right triangle, as you see here in the three squares, symbolizing the Pythagorean theorem, on the Siberian tundra, he would use pine trees and fields of wheat to create the shapes. He thought that surely that simple display would impress any observing Martians and really show off our intelligence here on Earth. A few years later, Austrian astronomer Joseph Johann von Littrow also thought about this idea of large displays of shapes, basic shapes, would really do the trick. So again, this universal language of mathematics. Instead of doing the triangle and with the fields of wheat and pine trees, he wanted to dig giant canals in the Sahara Desert and fill them with enough kerosene to burn for 6 hours at night. So a circle, for example, with a 20-mile diameter and trenches a few hundred yards wide, he thought would definitely catch Martians' eyes. Of course, if they did see it, they might think we were just a bunch of crazy pyromaniacs, and maybe they wouldn't want to actually talk to us. So these ideas, again, just theories and concepts, they didn't actually happen, but really fascinating to think that these, very brilliant people, well-known people, were thinking of ways that we could contact Martians, believing that they were there. Now, a few years later, French astronomer Camille Flammarion was one of the more vocal supporters of these beliefs. So in 1862, he wrote a book called The Plurality of Inhabited Worlds. And this was just 3 years after Darwin's On the Origin of Species introduced this concept of natural selection and evolution. So in Flammarion's writings, he argued that the existence of extraterrestrial life would be just like it was here on Earth. It would adapt to its environment and it would evolve. He thought that these laws applied everywhere in the physical universe. So Mars, being a smaller planet, would have cooled sooner, and therefore that evolutionary process would have begun earlier. So Martians, he thought, were far more advanced than we were because they got an earlier start. And he really longed to go there. He thought this was probably a much more civilized place because, again, they're so far advanced. And you feel that in this quote from him. As for me, I rather envy them, a world where it is always beautiful, where there are neither tempests nor cyclones, where the years are twice as long as ours, where, in a word, everything is lighter, more delicate, and more refined. So if we jump ahead to 1877, just about 15 years later, Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli sees canals. He's going through his telescope and he sees this network of crisscrossing lines over the Martian surface. Now, he actually called them canali, which translates to channels, which would be naturally made. But it was mistranslated to canals. And of course, canals are artificially made. And that's a huge difference. This set off a whole wave of excitement and concepts about how these canals were being created, why. And at that time, the Suez Canal had just been completed. And that took 10 years to make. And that was a massive engineering feat. So imagine seeing 10 years to create one canal and then discovering an entire planet is completely covered in them. You can imagine that they must have thought, wow, these guys must be immensely strong, brilliant engineers. How could they be so industrious and surpass us so much to have done that many canals? Clearly, quickly. So again, this was exciting. And it was exciting to no more exciting to someone than Percival Lowell. So Percival Lowell was of a very wealthy, known family. Lowell, Massachusetts is named after him. His family was entrenched in Harvard. Percival went to Harvard. And they were in the textile industry, and that's where they made their money. And it was expected that Percival would follow in their footsteps and take over the family business. But he did not have any interest in doing that. So instead, after graduating, he left the country for a while, went overseas, learned about other cultures. He comes back to America several years later, and he's hearing all the excitement about these canals on Mars. And he is also hearing that Schiaparelli is becoming blind. He's losing his eyesight, and he thinks, well, let me have him pass the torch to me, and I will make my name, not in textiles, but in being the one who finally connects with the Martians. So this is what he's determined to do. He's got the wealth to make this happen. He's able to go out to Flagstaff, Arizona, and he's able to set up an observatory, 7,000 feet in elevation out there, where he's got completely clear skies, no pollution, no lights from the cities. It's just open space, and he's got that great elevation to stare and gaze through his telescope at Mars. And you can see this is one of his maps that he saw through his telescope. So he's convinced that these Martians are digging away, and he's doing lots of interviews with newspapers. He's writing books. He's giving lectures nationally. Really excited about this concept. You can see here the reason for the belief that the planet is inhabited by human beings. It's a huge scheme of irrigation. So he thought the planet was dying, and it was using the polar caps to irrigate the whole planet. So they had to have canals to kind of carry the water throughout for everybody there. I love this one too. Finding Martians from a lonely mountain in Arizona. Here's the nice Martian staring back at him. This is a spread from the Big Book of Mars, and I love this article. This is pulled from the Washington Times, 1907. I love just seeing this giant Martian, this shovel with this massive pile of dirt. So you can see again, everyone was imagining what it must have been like over there. And they've got this great quote: "Fancy a company of Martian laborers imported from their distant planet to dig the Panama Canal. Digging such a little ditch would be a matter of merely a few weeks' exercise." So at this point, France had begun work on the Panama Canal in 1881, as you can see here. But the construction was eventually taken over by the United States in 1904, and it didn't open until 10 years later in 1914, so 7 years after this article. So you can see the frustration going on, and again, giving you some context as to why they must have thought these Martians were just so amazing that they could dig like that. So this is a fun article from 1904 that just gives you a sense of other scientific thoughts on what Martians might look like. So you have, in this case here, you've got sort of like fish gills to help breathe, but again, a large chest to breathe in that rarefied air. Here you've got these long arms and this sort of long nose, again, kind of pulling the scents around him. In some cases, they thought they might even be lizard-like. They weren't even sure. And up here you have the one that's fictional from H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, where it's more like that octopus-type creature from his story. Now, it wasn't just scientists, astronomers staring through telescopes that were getting excited about Mars and life on Mars. All that talk was influencing culture around it. So around the same time, this is right now we're kind of hovering around the turn of the century era. In the 1890s, spiritualism was a huge movement. This was a religion where people believed that you do not die and we could communicate with the dead. So they would go to mediums, hold seances. This was very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But in the 1890s, a Swiss medium named Helene Smith claimed that her spirit was visiting Mars, and she would return and she was describing what Mars looked like. And it won't surprise you that it was very similar to what Percival Lowell was saying. They were living alongside canals. They had their homes right there at the edge, so they had quick access to water. And this was their language. She said this was Martian writing. She was eventually studied by a psychologist who determined that this was basically just gibberish. Again, might not surprise you, but this was stuff that was said and believed by many in the 1890s. Now, Mars excitement also extended into advertising, again, reflecting culture. So this was a booklet called the Mars Gazette, and it was produced by a pharmaceutical company. They were selling liquid peptinoids, and this was like basically a cure-all. And the idea was that the doctors had sold all their liquid peptinoids to the planet Earth, and everybody had been cured here because it was so wonderful. So they had to expand their market, as you do as a business. So they went to Mars, and they found the sick Martians there, and they could cure them as well. And here you're seeing King Flammarion, a nice homage, who's riding atop this dragon, who's feeling great because he's had his liquid peptinoids. And all the Martians are feeling better as well. Here you have a couple of soap ads, again from around late 1890s, early 1900s. And I don't know why soap felt they had to advertise about Mars. I guess they thought the Martians didn't smell very good. But this is a pretty fun one. Mars is peopled and they want soap. And then here, send us up some pure soap, the first message from Mars. I would hope that if we do contact Martians, the first thing they'll ask for is won't be soap. Hopefully there'll be something more interesting we can talk about. But, again, they're taking advantage of what was popular at the time. So all this to me really gave a lot of context to a story that I always knew about as a kid that I thought was a really bizarre story in American history, which was the Orson Welles dramatization of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds in 1938 from October 30th. And here you see that headline, Radio Play Terrifies Nation. And I used to think, how could people think that Martians really landed and people panicked in the streets? How could this have actually happened? Why would people believe anything like that? It just sounds crazy. But when you see all the headlines I just took you through, and that's just a small sampling. There were headlines constantly in newspapers about potentially hearing from Martians soon, and they were well-respected scientists, as you saw, Tesla, Marconi, heads at Harvard, Amherst, other colleges as well. So these were respected people saying these things. So all of a sudden, this play comes on. Radio is a fairly new medium. World War II is breaking out this time over in Europe, and it's not unusual to have emergency break-ins to tell Americans what's going on. And to top it all off, people tuned in late. So they didn't hear Orson Welles announce that this was a dramatization at the top of the broadcast. And they tuned in late because the most popular thing on the radio at the time was Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, his dummy. This was a ventriloquism act. People loved it, and I don't understand how ventriloquism was so popular on radio, but that seems like maybe another talk for another time. But they tuned in late, and Orson Welles had done such a masterful job at, like I said, making this seem so authentic with the emergency break-ins, the different scientists being interviewed from different parts of the country, and then details coming from reporters live at Grover's Mill, New Jersey, where he placed the event as opposed to London, as H.G. Wells did in his story. So it all just felt very possible and real the way he did it, the timing of things, all just kind of coming together. But of course, as people realized that this was not happening, again, cause complete chaos, right? So you would think that this could never happen again at that point. But it actually did. It happened again 11 years later in 1949 in Quito, Ecuador. So in this case, you had two radio hosts who decided they wanted to drum up some publicity for their station. So they basically replicated what Orson Welles did. But in here, like Orson Welles placed it in America, New Jersey, they placed it right in the town next to them, next to Quito. So the Martians had landed in the next village over, and they did this with people impersonating the local priest, the local mayor. So everything just sounded again so authentic to people. In fact, the police force from Quito was actually racing across town to go to the next village over to help them with the fight. They actually were fleeing town to help. So people again were running in the streets, and then eventually word finally gets out, like it did in America, and people were really upset about it. They thought, "How could you fool us like this? This is terrible." So they got really angry, and they formed a mob, as you see in this headline, and they went down and they set fire to the radio station. And because of the massive crowds, the fire trucks actually couldn't get through the streets to get over there to help. So 15 people were injured, as you see here. 6 were actually killed. So Martians, real or not, eventually killed 6 people in Quito, Ecuador. So all of these stories, I know they sound, again, kind of crazy and wacky, but to me, they're all really important. They really did, like I said at the beginning, they really kept Mars in the public consciousness. And if you think about the different pop culture stories that came out of it, Lowell's Canals inspired a lot of these stories. Edgar Rice Burroughs, for example, John Carter starts off in a cave in Arizona, probably not far from Flagstaff, from Lowell's Observatory. And then Hugo Gernsback was also influenced by Percival Lowell's writings, and he published this magazine, among others, called Science and Invention. And here you see his depiction of a Martian evolution on Mars, not unlike Edmund Perrier's, as you can see, but he also has antennae. And the antenna, he believed, was because they could communicate telepathically, which again aligns right with Hugh Mansfield Robinson. Excuse me, my Hughes and Hugo's confused. In fact, I think this was from 1924, so just 2 years before Hugh Mansfield Robinson said he was in telepathic communication. So again, this idea was floating around. Lots of people are kind of thinking this way. Now, those stories and their writings were influencing people like Jack Parsons, who read Gernsback's magazines and other, I'm sure, other pop culture writings about Mars. And of course, his work eventually he worked with friends at Caltech to really develop the beginning of America's rocketry program. And that all led to the establishment of NASA JPL. And of course, their work, along with, again, that burgeoning space program, influenced a whole other generation of science fiction writers. Ray Bradbury with the Martian Chronicles, Arthur C. Clarke with The Sands of Mars, of course, many others. And Stranger in a Strangeland from Robert A. Heinlein. Again, these are just a few from these amazing writers, but all this was being influenced by what was going on. And that would then influence the next generation of scientists. So again, it goes from science to science fiction. Even some of the crazier science fiction, again, it's just keeping it in popular culture. It's bringing up, getting into the imagination of kids, inspiring them. This two-headed Martian is from an episode of The Twilight Zone called Mr. Dingle the Strong. It's one of my favorite shows ever. The Twilight Zone, this is one of the more quirky, comedic episodes. But the Martians come down and they're looking for humans to basically test their character. So they give Mr. Dingle super strength, and they wonder if he'll use it to help people and save people's lives or use it for the good of society. But instead, he just becomes a big exhibitionist. So they strip his powers and they go to another planet looking for intelligent life elsewhere. And this one, of course, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians from the 1960s. It's a wonderful poster, but it's a terrible movie. But it's fun. It's kitschy. It's one of those movies that's so bad it's good. Basically, what happens is The Martians find that their children are all depressed. They have nothing to give them joy. And they discover that Santa Claus gives kids joy on Earth. So they go to Earth to kidnap Santa Claus. And they do. And of course, the Earthlings have to go get Santa Claus back because we need him here. Again, you just have this idea of science fiction influencing science, which then influences science fiction again. It's a very symbiotic relationship. Eventually, all this gets us to the 1970s, the mid-70s, when we have our first landing on Mars with the Viking program, the 2 Viking landers. And this is the first image that came back. And you can see here, this is one of the legs of Viking that's landed on the surface. And that was a big deal at the time because not everyone was certain that Mars was going to be solid, that it could land. They thought potentially it could sink right in. So this was immediately good information to get. Of course, we got much more information. Tons of data came out of that program. And here you can even see just some of the sketches here of how Viking landers were set up with all this different equipment for testing and sending data back. And it actually had 4 different life detection experiments. One of them, called the labeled release experiment, both landers came back with positive results for life, which is amazing. I spoke with both of the experimenters when I was writing the Big Book of Mars, and they both stuck by their data for all these decades. NASA originally said that they believed it could have been a chemical reaction, exotic chemical reaction versus a biological reaction. But the experimenters, Dr. Gail Levin and Dr. Patricia Stratt, really stood by their data and felt that some sort of microorganism had metabolized this radioactive nutrient that they had dropped into the soil, and then checked the gas, which came back laced with the radioactivity. So this is something that has been repeated, but who knows? Maybe eventually we will find some sort of microscopic life beneath the surface of Mars, where we get past that radioactivity that would kill anything on the surface. So this brings us back to today. Here you're seeing Perseverance and Ingenuity, first helicopter on Mars. And if they don't find life on Mars, hopefully they'll pave the way for it. Whether that's directly on Mars, and you're seeing here, these are a couple of fun promo pieces that SpaceX put out a few years back. The idea of space tourism and visiting Mars and traveling to the solar system's highest peak, or even going through the canyon, Valles Marineris. Again, you can imagine the space tourism that could eventually come. But maybe we'll actually just end up close to Mars. And this was an idea that Dr. Jim Logan, a former NASA flight surgeon, proposed and told me about when I was writing the Big Book of Mars. He said that Deimos, one of the 2 moons of Mars, would be a safer place to live. Inside Deimos, that is. He thought we would have to core it out, and then we could put space stations inside, giant space stations that would have artificial gravity to allow us to simulate life on Earth. But you live inside the moon, not on top of it. And that would give us complete protection from the solar radiation. So we thought that was a much safer place to go than on the surface of Mars, which is incredibly dangerous. It's not really suited to human life at all there. So that was an interesting idea. And I asked them, well, how do you core out a moon? That sounds like quite a tall task. And I love the quote he gave me, his response. He said, any intelligent civilization that can travel 560 million kilometers to a destination and is unwilling or unable to dig a hole doesn't deserve to be there in the first place. So I thought that's a good point. And so I asked him, well, how long do you think it would take to do that? And he said, well, it'll take about 20 years after we stop laughing about it. And his point there was a really good one. And he brought up the fact that flight in general, human flight, was something that had been laughed at, for forever, until the early 1900s, when the Wright brothers, for example, put mathematics and physics to work, and eventually they flew. That was a first flight, right? They stopped laughing about it, and they actually did it. About 30 years later, you have Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. That's a major step in 30 years. And then just a little over 30 years after that, you have the Apollo 11 mission where we land on the moon. So imagine going from Wright brothers in the early 1900s flying, early 1930s you got Lindbergh, and by the end of the 60s we're on the moon. That's a massive jump forward in just roughly 70 years, less than 70 years. So again, this idea that put math and physics to work and we can figure these things out. And maybe we will end up on Mars. And if we do, there'll be different ways that we can find habitats that protect us. This is an example called Mars Ice House. Ice, water is good protection from solar radiation. So maybe we're 3D printing ice houses and we're living there, or we're living inside craters. We'll see. But once we do, we may end up being the Martians that science fiction writers had always talked about, and scientists that actually believe we're there. They could be us one day. So thank you for being curious. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.